Our guest this week is Michael Scott, Colonel Retired, I think is the correct title. Michael, welcome back to Behind the Headlines. It's lovely having you here.
Hey, Adam, Gary, my honour to be with you here today.
Gary Max is joining as our co-host. Co-host. Quick summary. Michael, when last we spoke, you were talking to us about your first book, A Light Still Burns. Mm-hmm. You're here today to talk about your second book, When Our Light is Tested, when we'll unpack that in a minute. But also, Michael, I know as well as an author, you're the CEO of the 2023 Foundation, which is a not-for-profit for combating antisemitism. I understand sponsoring educational pathways as well. I know you were doing some work in education and fostering peaceful coexistence in the Australian community. Michael, welcome back. How's it all going?
Hey, wonderful to be with you and your listeners. Aussie, Goy, Zionist, Colonel, someone that can look people in the eye and say that there is no contradiction with being a secular, apolitical, non-Jewish veteran and standing publicly and apologetically with the only democracy in the Middle East and a beautiful diaspora Jewish community globally that are being subjected to Orwellian levels of gaslighting and projection and criminal abuse. And so if I can say to all of your listeners to start with, you are not alone. I am with you. I see you. I hear you. I'm doing everything in my power to make sure that Shazza and Dazza, the great Australians, understand what's happening to Shlomo and Miriam and their family down the road. It's unacceptable. I am so sorry how you, Adam, you, Gary, and your beautiful listeners have been treated for the last couple of years in your country of birth.
Michael, that's a extremely heartfelt and well-received expression of both intent and emotion. We feel so much part of just being part of Australia that it has taken 2.5 years to come to terms with the changes that are occurring and are still occurring. And I'll ask how you think things are going. Before we do that, take us on the journey of your books, because I know that you've written book 1 and this is book 2, but there's something larger afoot here. Give us the background on that.
A genuine and earnest desire to connect with people, to help them understand what is happening all around us. I believe we live in a period of historical significance where too many people around us are unaware that Israel is fighting yet winning an existential war against not only a couple of terrorist states, the Ayatollahs in Iran, supported by Erdogan's Turkey, Qatar, a couple of superpowers that are malevolent towards not only Israel but the US, but the Western world, the democracies of the world that are becoming comfortable, complacent, and historically illiterate. We're losing what I believe is an existential war of values, identity, and legacy, because I think where too many people are looking through binoculars 14,000 kilometres away to what they believe they think is going on in Gaza. I ask my dear friends, look, step back from those binoculars, turn your head, because your own house is in flames, your street is smouldering. We've got a real problem here in Australia and we need to do something about it. And if I want a new idea, I pick up an old book. Einstein, I believe, is right when he said that if you had 60 minutes to solve a problem, that is to save the world, take 55 minutes to understand the problem and 5 minutes to resolve it. And in my writing, I try to give people insights based on my experience, my command in Afghanistan, my over 2 years as a senior leader in the United Nations, working in Israel and the Levant, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt, to paint a picture about how that relates to what's going on back home.
A question I've been asking for the last, it's almost 3 years, is what does the average Aussie think about the situation and think about their Jewish friends here in Australia, because it's hard to tell who comes up to the gate and says hi, who doesn't. The great silent majority is unfortunately silent.
I think if we use a historical example, Winston Churchill, who in my judgment was the greatest ever Anglo-Saxon, he started writing weekly newspaper articles in about 1937 about what the threat to Nazi and Hitler would mean not only to Western Europe, but the UK and world peace. People weren't ready to hear that. And so it was only in 1940 that people saw, my goodness, the problem is undeniable now and we're on catch up. I think the average Australian doesn't feel what we feel. They're not aware of what's going on. And the reason I say that is that I was back in Melbourne a couple of weeks ago, and a dear Jewish friend talked to me about her non-Jewish friend that lived in Caulfield. And my Jewish friend told her a little bit about what was going on. And the response was, anti-Semitism, is that still going on? It's worsened since Bondi. And I think that where you and I will drive up Glen Ira and we'll see a security guard on the side of the road. And if we don't know the area, it's like, I wonder which Jewish facility this is. Is it a preschool? Is it a community centre? Is it an aged care centre? I think Shazza and Dazza, our non-Jewish friends that are our neighbours, they drive up the street and they don't notice it. And so part of, I think, my unique value proposition is that I try to make the complex simple and the simple compelling to help people understand what is going on. But if I can make one more point, if I ask you, dear people, and your listeners to do a thought experiment with me, to forget everything you know about Judaism and everything you know about the Jewish state, if your only source of truth was the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, we would be inverted. I think the best of us would come to a position, well, that's pretty conclusive. But let me get a second opinion. Let me check with what the United Nations has to say. Oh, there's a similarity. But wait, I want a third and a fourth opinion. I want to check with the ICRC and I want to check with Amnesty International. There's been a long march, ladies and gentlemen, through our institutions. Antonio Gramsci talked about this, a social Marxist. The bigoted, dishonest and sinister gang that so disrupts Jewish students in universities have infected a number of institutions that we grew up trusting.
I agree with that idea of the long march, but I think that's even different today, Michael. The ABC mirrors its international sources, which are fundamentally Al Jazeera, more than journalists as advocates. They are advocates. The ABC is not journalistic, it's advocacy. I've written at length about it.
Although, can I just interject?
Sure.
It's interesting. The ABC's Middle East correspondent lives in Jerusalem.
Yeah, because it's safe. Because it's safe.
I know, but you know,
but that doesn't mean they haven't.
Paradox.
That doesn't mean they haven't taken the narrative.
Sure.
And they have. They've taken the red pill.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
But the ABC sources are Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera is Qatar. Its sources are the United Nations and the various committees that pump all this out. In a world where, Michael, the media's got to compete with the outrage machines in our pockets, there's a dynamic here also of wanting the thin, outrageous headline to grab our attention away from the other outrage machines that are out there. So I agree with you that it's partly ideological, but I also think it's structural. And and that makes the problem for Shazza and Dazza, as you say, who would rather not have to deal with all of this, easy to walk by. Let's come back to your new book, When Our Light is Tested. Michael, the book's subtitle is The Bondi Massacre and the Choices Ahead. Most books deal with what happened. You focus on how did we get here? And if you had these next few minutes to convince a sceptical Australian that Bondi wasn't merely the act of two religious extremists, but was a chain of events that you believe led to that moment. What would you say to them?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges that we face, and we're always facing challenging terrain when we're trying to forecast and predict things that haven't happened. There's no such thing as the foreseeable future, but in my judgment, we can look at meta trends and trend analysis, and we do have the historical record to look backwards to give an indication of what we may see going forward. The Bondi Massacre on the 14th of December involved people that I personally know. It wasn't just an attack on Jewish Australians, it was an attack on all Australians. And I was frightened in the days after with what I call the Sarah Ferguson, the Kathy Wilcox, or the Laura Tinkle effect. People that Australians have grown up trusting immediately started spinning this into something other than what I believe is going on. I have no political ambitions, but as a father and as a humanist and a patriotic Australian that is running a charity to combat anti-Semitism through education and lived experience, I want to put the cards on the table, step back and let people look at them and think about what it means. It's my troubled judgment that the choice before Australians is binary. We either stick up for our family, our values and our way of life. That's door number one. Door number two is we accept the consequences of our complacency and cravenness. And I would ask the readers to take a deep breath, because what I've just put on the table is quite heavy. But John Stuart Mill, the founder of modern liberalism, I think provides us sage advice here, where Mill says that while war is an ugly thing, it's not the ugliest of things. We only need to countenance what peace, as defined by Islamic State, Muslim Brotherhood, or Al-Qaeda may look like, to understand that ours are values at risk, ours are values worth defending. And what I mean specifically, having lived in Israel, lived in Jerusalem, Israel's eternal capital, free market economics, the rule of law, the emancipation of women, the protection of minorities, they are all Jewish values. They are all Israeli values. They are all Western and Australian values. Those are values at risk. Those are values worth defending. And if not us, who? If not now, after Bondi, when?
Yeah, exactly right. You talk about threats to our society. You spent your life in the army analysing threats before they became crises. In this book, you apply that to Australian society. You apply that mindset, Michael. What warning indicators did you see that civilians, politicians and the media either dismissed or similarly failed to recognise in the lead up to Bondi?
Geez, there's a string of examples since the 9th of October 2023 where I heard in Australia something I never expected. Gas the Jews, F the Jews. That was my tipping point from career one into what follows. I've written a little bit about that in A Light Still Burns, Israel and the Values Worth Defending. I talked to missed opportunities, and if we had our time again, I think that I would refer your listeners to my first book to help set the conditions for that. But the other thing I'd ask to pass on to your listeners, because I would imagine that the dear people that are dialing in here, they don't need any convincing. It's about reaching the non-Jewish friends on their periphery. And that's the basis of my books, because it's hard for us to talk with people that don't get it. It's triggering. And so what I've tried to do is provide a couple of bits in writing that people that understand it can read through and they say, wow, these are topics I'm familiar with, but I understand how this could appeal to people that didn't grow up in an echo chamber, because it's written by a patriotic non-Jewish Australian that didn't grow up in an echo chamber. I think one of the things we're dealing with here is that problems may be difficult to diagnose at the start, but easy to treat. I think time is a vector in this regard, that the longer we leave things, it's going to become really easy to diagnose, but catastrophically difficult to treat. And I'm hoping to just give people a chance to use my unusual experience as someone that's read everything from Noam Chomsky and Gore Vidal to Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld and Alan Dershowitz, that's commanded Australian soldiers in Afghanistan, that's been into Gaza with the IDF and has thought a lot about these issues, to put it down in writing in a manner that they can digest in small chunks and think about it, engage with their people on their periphery.
I mean, to me, the big question that you pose or help answer is what responsibility do we have as the Jewish community here in Australia to educate our fellow citizens? Because clearly, if institutions aren't handling it well, then we have a responsibility to make sure our message gets across.
You dear people are the light unto the nations. But I think those like myself, like Erin Molan, like Nova Peris, like Richard Kemp, like Douglas Murray, we've got an ability to translate and to assist. I'm not in competition with anyone. I'm a genuine, humble Australian that was born in Mount Isa. Bit of lead on the brain first up is always good. I grew up in Queensland. I joined the army at 17. I just try and be a little bit better tomorrow than I was yesterday and today. But I see that this is existential for the Australia that I would like to bequeath in time to my unborn grandkids. And a couple of months after Anzac Day, where all Australians are encouraged to think about the legacy that previous generations gave us, the baton has passed. Everyone gave something, some gave everything. The people that are adults today, it's happened on our watch. As we've been looking elsewhere, it's happened. And we've got a duty of care and responsibility to hand on tomorrow to our kids, in my case, my unborn grandkids, in a manner a little bit better than what we're seeing at the moment, because the trends point to a deterioration further. And that's the thing that shocked me. After October 7 and October 9, I was hoping that that was a wake-up call. And then the 14th of December, Bondi, murders in our most intimate places. But Dr. Andre Oberle and the Online Hate Prevention Institute quantifies what we qualitatively know. Antisemitism has worsened since. And so we really need to speak to Shazza and Dazza, understanding that we get more with honey than we do with vinegar, and we also have a problem by sharing a problem. And I'm hoping to overcome that barrier that you, Adam, and you, Gary, may have faced with some of your non-Jewish friends. Of course you think that, Adam. You're Jewish. Well, Michael is not. Michael is apolitical. He's a secular Australian. His courage hasn't been tested. He's been in and seen up close what Joseph Conrad would refer to as the heart of darkness. He's written a couple of books that have got cracking testimonials. Do please have a read at a pace that you're comfortable with, because we've got to start orienting to what's going on. It's getting out of hand.
One of your most intriguing chapters in the book is hacking the human brain, the 6th operational domain. Really enjoyed that, because you argue, or are you arguing, that modern conflicts are increasingly won not on the battlefield, but inside the minds of people in democratic societies? And if so, I mean, the trick question is who is winning that battle? But then what's the cure?
Let's start with what is the nature of war. The nature of war is a violent clash of wills. It's political outcomes through other means. Or said really simply in one word, it's competition. And so when in about 2011, I served in the Directorate of Army Research and Analysis, where I was asked by the Chief of Army to think through the Army After Next and the operational environment in which Australian soldiers may behave and operate, achieve decisions and objectives in 2035, I had to do over-the-horizon gazing. And so one of the ways that I could do that meaningfully is think, well, how is competition playing out at the moment? We see competition in the 5 operational domains: air, sea, space, land, and cyber. And so I spoke with a number of smart PhDs that wore socks with sandals and pocket protectors. And I said, where might competition play out next? And they went away and came back a couple of days later and thought, I think it'll be hacking of the human mind. And at the time we thought, was that chemical stimulation? Is there a way of manipulating brainwaves? But we've seen that. We've seen that with the Australian Broadcasting Corporation and social media. We know theoretically that if enough mud is slung, a little bit sticks. And those that...
It's an old story.
Those that are believing what we do, demographically, we're dying of old age. We're falling off the perch. Those that are coming through our schools and universities, they're inverted into thinking 2 + 2 = 5.
It's an old story. It's, when you think of how the German nation, the incredible story of Germany in the 19th century, the flower of creativity, philosophy, politics. It was an amazing, over the 1700s and 1800s. And then you get to Nazi Germany, and it's like the expression is wrong, but it's appropriate, drunk the Kool-Aid. They're all convinced of this ideology because of the circumstances in which they've come from and the power and charisma and all of that. Michael, that's an old story. It's not a new story. So the 6th domain, which is the influence on people in society, you've put the dangers to the mainstream media or parts of the mainstream media. Where else do you see the battlefield taking place?
It's urgent. You want a new idea, you pick up an old book. Said a different way to what you just put down, Germany and Austria were the 2 most enlightened countries globally at the time.
They were.
And look what happened. And so we are deceiving ourselves if we think that this could not happen again in the comfortable and complacent and historically illiterate West. What we're seeing in Australia, we're also seeing across the Anglosphere. We're seeing in other democracies. And one of the challenges is there's a form of groupthink where ideology has replaced reality. And part of the reason that I founded the charity modelled on the Fulbright Scholarship is that I think that the best way to overcome Orwellian levels of gaslighting and misinformation is lived experience. I believe Natan Sharansky is right. You cannot combat anti-Semitism separate to a defence of the Jewish state. Now, non-Jews won't defend Israel if all they know about Israel is what they get from the ABC. And so I need to break through captured media that are giving us an inverted perspective. Matt Doran, you mentioned before, that cat is in Jerusalem when he's not reporting elsewhere. I think he probably lives around the American colony and he's in that milieu of hard left lunatics that gaslight and pass off to all of their listeners globally a similar Kool-Aid. That's part of the problem. And so what I want to do is break through that and find reasonable, open-minded individuals that have an assessed return on investment opportunity. I asked my friends in the Labor Party, for example, that in 1951, a 22-year-old Bob Hawke applied for the Rhodes Scholarship to study in Oxford. Who are the young Australians at the moment that might have those knowledge, skills, attitudes and experiences rather than the UK that could study in Israel? If someone is theological, a master's of religious studies at Hebrew University, if they're business-minded, an MBA, Kohler Advanced School of Management, Tel Aviv University, if some of your listeners are thinking, my non-Jewish neighbour is an absolute whiz in IT, I would like to connect him with Michael because the Technion might be a place that he could get a scholarship to further his career. And so I'm not looking at only framing the problem, I'm looking at doing something about it. And no one put me on a contract after my 27 months in Israel to say, Michael, we would like you to be one of the leading global champions of the fight against anti-Semitism. I'm doing this because I want to, because I see that my children are at risk as much as yours are. I'm looking at fostering the next generation of Douglas Murrays, Richard Kemps, Erin Molan, Gemma Tognini, Nova Peris. And I'm looking at partnering and collaborating, including with the listeners of this wonderful show.
Okay. Which brings me to a phrase. I mean, it's leading. You've led the conversation well, Michael, to this phrase you've used throughout the book. And that's the phrase moral clarity. You've used it. It's the most common phrase in your book that I saw. You know, critics will say moral clarity oversimplifies complex issues. How do you distinguish moral clarity from the ideological partisanship you have seen? If I take the example, and I've spoken to plenty of ABC, I don't call them journalists anymore, activists, that they see a moral clarity because they've, you know, taken the red pill of whatever narrative they believe. So clarify that for me, what you mean by that phrase and how that applies to Australia right now.
Let me paraphrase B.A. Santa Maria. Always bet on self-interest. It's the only horse always pulling in every race. As someone that has worn the cloth of my country since I was 17, and I've been to a couple of war zones and participated in combat, when I saw what happened at the Opera House on the 9th of October, that was enough. I was going to stand in between monsters and Shlomo and Miriam at my back and do everything I could. Now, I don't think I'm anything special. I've just tested myself in the past and it's given me a level of consciousness going forward. But the average Australian doesn't feel that they understand this situation. They're gaslit into an inverted perspective. We saw that on the 3rd of August last year, where nearly 100,000 people from Australia marched across the Sydney Harbour Bridge in the rain behind banners that included the Taliban, the Ayatollahs, and recognised terrorist organisations.
Yeah.
And so I think we all understand that we can't reason a person out of a position that they didn't reason themselves into in the first place. I could be put in front of Sarah Schwartz. I could be put in front of Louise Adler or Kathy Wilcox or Sarah Ferguson. I don't believe it's a good return on investment. I just do my emotional energy in. But for people that get it, if you've got reasonable, open-minded people on the periphery that might be interested in having a conversation, a two-way conversation, they might even ask me, well, tell me about dead babies in Gaza. I can look someone in the eye and say, look, that triggers me. I'm a father and I'm a humanist. That triggers all of my Jewish friends. Dead babies anywhere is abominable. But let's understand the facts. It's our enemies that are trying to compromise us into an inverted perspective, not our ideological opponents, but our enemies. There's people with an agenda that are trying to gaslit people into an inverted perspective, but don't look at where the noise is, look at where else is happening. And again, that's the framing of my books. I don't say only read my book. I've read Peter Beinart. I've read Edward Said. I've read John Lyons. But for goodness sakes, if you've got any instinct for the safety of your unborn descendants here in distant Australia, do please add my books to your reading list for 2026.
Let me come back to the moral clarity phrase. What do you mean by that? You've given fantastic illustration now of how that applies. What do you mean by moral clarity when it comes to this conflict?
Isn't that a cracking, difficult, loaded question as well? Because if we think at the most basic, the two-state solution, well, can't we split the difference? You know, that great cartoon years ago of we want to live, we want to kill you all. Can't you find a middle ground? Part of my analysis is what I believe is the correct historical framing. I'm not an ideologue. I look people in the eye and say, objectively, over the last 80 years, there's only ever been one side that has desperately sought peace with their neighbour. That is the Jewish state. The other side has only and consistently sought Judenrein, a Nazi-era term that means free of Jews, and endless litigation of bad behaviour. Now, putting it into simple terms that people in Australia understand, if a toddler is having a tantrum, do you give them a bowl of ice cream? No, you don't, because the next time they have a tantrum, you got to put chocolate on the ice cream. And so we've got to stop throwing good money after bad. We need to take a deep breath. We need to understand what's actually going on a little bit more detail, because otherwise we are manipulated into an inverted perspective, thinking we're exercising our agency and our moral clarity, but backing the wrong horse. And again, part of my writing has tried to provide cognitive lenses, different ways of looking at relevant factors in a couple of easily digestible books in independent standalone chapters that orient people to make up their own mind. And if you haven't yet seen A Light Still Burns, Israel and the Values Worth Defending, or When Our Light is Tested, The Bondi Massacre and the Choices Ahead, you're probably not following me on Facebook or LinkedIn, because I am smashing those platforms. And it was a great honour earlier this month to appear in Melbourne at the Melbourne Jewish Book Week, along some other upstanders, including Kylie Moore-Gilbert, Rochelle Unrich, Lee Kaufman, and Josh's mum, Erica Frydenberg.
You talk about Israel, the historical context. And of course, a lot of that is shaped by the language we've been talking about, the institutional language, especially in ABC, in universities. Whose responsibility is it to lead a real language change? I mean, and when I say a real language, I mean a language in the context of historical fact.
So look, we can think we can outsource this to our elected leaders. We can think we can outsource this to a Royal Commission, or we can think we can outsource this to our community leaders. Now, they're all great. We have to compete through all of those vectors, but I've always felt really passionately in an individual acceptance of responsibility. And so I'm exercising my agency consistent with my conscience, but I ask myself the simple binary choice. If I am too frightened to do something today, like wear a tie with a Magen David, wear a badge on above my heart
with the Israeli flag,
Australia and an Israeli flag. If I am too frightened to do that today, will it be any easier or even more difficult for my children in 15 years' time? On balance, I think it's getting completely out of hand. And if not us, who? If not now, when? Please, let's not talk about what someone else other than us can do. Let's listen to JFK. Not just for Kiddush, but John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. We have agency, and when I have found most desperate in my life, it's when things are happening around me, carrying me in the wrong direction, and I can't do anything. So let's take a deep breath. Let's stop being frozen like so many of my dear friends are. This isn't me. Why does everyone hate me? It must be something I'm doing wrong. No, we just need to take a deep breath, believe in your Jewish values. You're pointing in the right direction, and set off into a better tomorrow at a pace you can sustain with a burden that you can carry, and join me.
I think that's just one of the most uplifting messages I've heard for a long time. And it is an uplifting message. And Michael, the word that circulates around what you just said to me is patriotism, is supporting your country and doing the right thing by it because you support what it is and what it stands for and the values upon which it is grounded. Why is patriotism a dirty word? And why aren't there enough, I hesitate to say why aren't there enough patriots, but because that itself could be taken in a political, and often is by the far right as much, against the far. I don't mean it in that context, but standing with the values, taking personal agency to do the right thing in the centre, and I'm going to call it, because that's what it is, it's reclaiming the centre, it's what I believe very strongly. Why is it so hard? And we've talked about social media, we've talked about media, but what's happening that we seem to be nulled into inaction?
Yeah, look, complacency is a killer. As a society, we've lost our instinct for danger. Francis Fukuyama wrote a cracking book a number of years ago, An End of History. I fell into the end of history delusion. Even though I was a soldier, I stood with monsters to my front, with families to my back in a number of parts of the world. I don't think people yet realise that we're in a period of historical significance where the forward progression of mankind is not assured. If we don't defend our values and our way of life, we could lose our values and our way of life. And again, part of my quiet conversation, and I'm trying to be super careful, not being seen as, that ex-army guy, he's a hammer, so all of the problems he sees as nails. When I'm invited to speak with friends in the Labor Party or people on the hard left of the political spectrum, or I'm talking with members of the Christian church, or I'm speaking with members of the Liberal Party, it's a similar message. My message is where Don Chip started out, 35% either side. It's that there is no contradiction for me being a patriotic, apolitical, secular Australian veteran and unapologetic Zionist. Jewish values are Israeli values, are Australian values, are Western values. Our values and our way of life are at risk. Our values ought to be defended. And putting that down in simple essays to help people understand what's going on, because we've got to understand the problem before we launch out at trying to resolve it. We're gonna fix the wrong problem unless we understand it fully.
Yep. And your book does the final section, the upward path. There's hundreds of pages documenting drift, complacency, denial, and institutional failure. Yet you finish optimistically, right? And you do. What gives you, Michael, the confidence that Australia can change course?
You dear people, and I would imagine the majority of your listeners are the descendants of the Maccabees. I trace my heritage to the Anzacs. The people that are picking fights with us have no idea what they're doing. The hornet's nest they're stirring up. Golda Meir once said, there's a secret. There's no plan B. But said another way, you've got the most industrious, innovative 0.2% of the world's population that have risen to the apex, whether it be in music or the arts or law, you name it. Jewish people have risen to the top. I once asked one of my directors, mate, how is that possible? That's been achieved. And this Jewish fella from Israel said, mate, that's easy. Jewish mothers. We will adapt, we will innovate, and we will win because there's no plan B. We just can't make Aliyah or race to Florida or go off the grid in Thailand because two big things are happening at the moment. Israel is fighting and Israel is winning, but the West is falling. If Israel... I've contemplated in my first book, The Unthinkable. Should Israel fall? It's my judgment that the world tips into another dark age if the Jewish state falls. But of course, if the Western world fails, the Jewish state may be the modern manifestation of Masada. You just need to look at the nonsense that Western Europe was inflicting upon Jewish artists in Eurovision. Imagine that change to raw materials, etc., etc. And so to my dear friends that are listening into your program, and it's a great honour to be back speaking with you, Adam, meeting Gary and interacting with your readership. It is tough. It is daunting, but it's going to get worse and worse until we step up. Yes, we can. Teamwork is how the dream works. Anyone that would want to reach out and speak with me, the answer is yes, because I've got some insights that may just tip someone from thinking, I want to do something, but I'm not quite sure what or how, to, my goodness, I've got that level of clarity and I am off. I can influence as a node. I have a network. From a drop can create a ripple. From a ripple, a wave.
That's great confidence to have that. As the expression, Michael, goes, one conversation at a time.
Yeah.
And if the right number of them in the right sequence occur, then it's more than one conversation that's changing the world.
That's right.
It's the butterfly effect.
It is.
Right. Yep. And which comes to the point of language as well, which is what a lot of colouring the current situation has been about, the misuse of language and with it the misuse or the ignorance of facts. And I think that's where a lot of our responsibility as a community lies. There is a great ignorance of facts, and we should not let it pass. It's very important. When you were in Jerusalem, of course, that was how long ago?
July 2019 to September 2021, 8 months before COVID. It was the only time in my life that I looked over to my wife, Tresina, May 2021, and said, "Sweetheart, they're not fireworks, they're rockets. Let's go into the Mamad." A few things were happening at the time, but I started off as a Zionist in my early 20s, but living in Israel for a couple of years, I was strictly apolitical. I was there to exercise the mission and the mandate of an unarmed UN peacekeeping force, but I built a deep personal connection with Israel and Israelis, secular Orthodox Jews, Druze, Arab Christians and Muslims, my friends. And so when someone looks at me and asks a question in a cafe in Sydney, tell me a bit about what it's like, I can look someone in the eye and explain, and you can see that it's like, geez, I'd love to see that. And with the 2023 Foundation, I've got vehicles to allow people to see that. And just imagine if hypothetically a Douglas Murray 25, 30 years ago had an opportunity like this. It's like, wow, he's on his way. And that's the sort of upstander influences that I'm looking at speaking to at the moment. Or, as I mentioned before, a 22-year-old Bob Hawke that applied for the Rhodes Scholarship in 1951. Look at what that wonderful Australian grew into. I'd like to be a part of helping individuals on their path to a better tomorrow from here decades into the future.
100% right, Michael. We've been taking Labor people to Israel for a long time. And there are premiers who are graduates of our program who've stood firmly with the Jewish community because they get it. You know, to go to Israel is to know it and to understand it. It's certainly not a white horse what is it, white knight on a white horse charging through.
Not enough people go. Enough people go to Israel.
To go it is to see it.
And indeed, one of the things I found, I'm not looking at fratriciding AJAC. I'm not looking at fratriciding you, fratriciding any of the existing organisations that are doing this. Part of my unique value proposition, and it came out really well with a young Jewish Labor Zionist in Sydney. He told me a story about someone I won't name, but left of the ALP, non-Jewish. He was approached by my friends in AJAC and said, "Look, we'd like to bring you across on the Rambun project." The kid's response was, under no circumstances. The perception was that AJAC were politically aligned. Now, I think that that's completely unfair, but perception is reality. I met with this young kid in July, as well as a number of other non-Jewish Labor people in their branch. I talked a little bit about me. I talked a little bit about my connection to Israel as an unarmed UN peacekeeper. I talked a little bit about my charity. And then I answered questions, and the body language was great. And I've heard, look, I'd love to do that. Just don't put me on social media because I don't want my milieu to attack me. You know, I've been in the military for over 30 years. I'm out now, but I've learnt that what Colin Powell says about you no longer are leading your people when they no longer bring you their problems is true. People tell me things because they trust me, and I don't out them. I enable and empower them. And if I can empower that young Labor left individual to have great experiences, to capture a bunch of things on his phone, I don't need him to put that on TikTok or Blue Sky or Instagram. But if he down the track is saying, well, look, mate, I didn't tell you at the time, but in 2027, I went to Israel with a charity run by an Australian veteran. His name's Michael Scott. He'll talk your damn ear off if you give him a hand. But he linked me up with Peter Lerner at the Histadrut. I saw people that have the same politics as I do over in Israel. They're great people. They just speak a bit funny. And my goodness, Tel Aviv, it looked just like Sydney or Melbourne. Here I was thinking, how on earth am I going to plug in my iPhone into a camel, but it was wonderful.
Right. Keep going.
All right. Michael, coming to the last question. If every Australian read your book this week, what is the one question you hope they would ask themselves before they put it back on the shelf?
Am I contributing to a better tomorrow, or am I part of a bad yesterday?
Oh, nicely said. Which implies all the agency in the world to do something about the circumstances in which we find ourselves. 20 years from now, what would you hope historians will write about Bondi? And I frame that as my last question in this way. Is it the beginning of Australia's decline, or is it the shock that finally caused the country to discover its moral confidence?
Let's be honest. The way our society is pointing is the wrong direction. It's not in a direction that I aspire to bequeath in time my kids. It's my judgment as a father, as a humanist, as a former military professional in the profession of arms, and a student of history, that the next 25 years in Australia and across the West will be more challenging than the last. 25 years ago was 9/11. That included the Bali bombings. It included October 7, 14 December, and a number of other challenges.
Tavistock, the terrible things.
We are going the wrong way as a civilization. And so, ladies and gentlemen, the longer we leave this, the harder it's going to get for us to dig our way out of this mess. We will win in the end. If we're not winning at a point in time, it's not the end. But what I'm trying to avoid through the sinusoidal wave of history is that the downwards trajectory doesn't go as far as it otherwise may through my agency. I'm looking at doing everything in my power to smooth that downward curve, knowing that Gandhi is right. Gandhi is right when he said that when we embark on resolving big problems, there's no guarantee we'll win. There's no guarantee we'll succeed. But what we know with precision is if we do nothing, we will fail.
Yes.
And so back to your point, Adam, we have agency. We need to take a deep breath. We need to read, preferably my book, and then we need to think through how we most strategically exercise that agency to bequeath in time a better tomorrow in Australia for our unborn descendants than the way it's currently pointing.
Michael Scott, that's a brilliant way to finish the program today. Thank you so much for your time. All power to you. May the strength of the 2023 Foundation continue and continue spreading a good word, one conversation at a time. Gary Max, thank you for sharing the interviews today. And listeners, you've been listening to Behind the Headlines.